Hansioren's manicured hand moved so fast Zuri barely saw it coming. The slap cracked across her face like a gunshot in the marble hallway, snapping her head sideways, splitting the corner of her lip open against her own teeth. The pain arrived half a second later, sharp, electric, humiliating. Zuri's hand flew to her cheek instinctively, fingers pressing against the heat blooming beneath her skin. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Sioren's voice was silk wrapped around broken glass. She stood there in her cream cashmere coat and her $300 lipstick, looking at Zuri the way a person looks at something tracked in on the bottom of their shoe. "Sneaking food to that child like I'm some kind of monster." She stepped closer. Zuri didn't step back. "You are a monster," Zuri said. Her voice shook, but she didn't drop her eyes. That was the wrong answer. If you've ever watched someone hurt a child and felt completely powerless to stop it, if you've ever been the only person in the room willing to do the right thing while everyone else looked away, then you already understand exactly what Zuri Coleman was feeling in that moment. And if you've never been in that position, I promise you, by the time this story ends, you'll understand it better than you ever wanted to. Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chapter of this story, because it goes places you will not see coming. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Zuri Coleman had been in Seoul for 3 years before she learned that the most dangerous thing about working for Kang Do-jin wasn't the guns, the encrypted phones, the men who stood outside conference room doors with their hands folded in front of them like they were praying. It wasn't the way conversations stopped when she walked into a room, or the way certain executives refused to hand documents directly to her and instead set them on the edge of her desk like physical contact might be contagious. The most dangerous thing about working for Kang Do-jin was how easy it was to stop noticing the danger. She'd gotten too comfortable. That was the honest truth, and Zuri was the kind of person who needed honest truths the way other people needed air. She'd arrived at Kang Syndicate headquarters as a 26-year-old executive secretary fresh off a corporate placement contract, telling herself it was temporary. 3 years later, she knew where every emergency exit was. She knew which bodyguards took their coffee black and which ones preferred it sweet. And she knew that the small girl who sometimes appeared at the glass door of the executive suite on quiet Sunday afternoons was the only person in the entire building who made Kang Do-jin look like a human being. Hae-eun was 6 years old and had her father's eyes, dark, watchful, missing nothing. But where Do-jin's gaze could strip the confidence from a man in 3 seconds flat, Hae-eun's eyes held something broken and patient, like a window cracked just enough to let in cold air, but not enough to let anyone reach through. She didn't speak much. The psychologists who rotated through on Thursdays had labeled it situational mutism, a response to the explosion 2 years ago that had killed her mother and left Hae-eun with scar tissue along her left forearm and a silence that had outlasted everyone's expectations of how long a child could go without properly laughing. She laughed with Zuri, though. Not big, not often. Small laughs, surprised ones, the kind that slipped out before the child could catch herself. Zuri had discovered early on that Hae-eun responded to consistency more than kindness. So she showed up. She remembered that Hae-eun disliked the smell of the cafeteria's Tuesday soup and preferred drawing with blue pens over black ones. She kept a small sketchbook in her bottom desk drawer that she'd bought specifically because Hae-eun had once spent 40 minutes drawing increasingly elaborate horses in the margins of syndicate financial reports. And Zuri had thought, this kid needs better paper. It was not in Zuri's job description. None of it was. But Hae-eun had chosen her the way children choose things, without logic, without negotiation, with the complete and terrifying certainty of a 6-year-old who has decided you are safe. Zuri had not felt particularly safe herself in a long time. She was 29 now, and she carried herself with the careful awareness of a woman who had spent most of her adult life being the wrong size in the wrong room. In Cincinnati, where she'd grown up, she'd been the big girl with the good grades and the habit of making herself smaller in photographs. In Seoul, she was the big black woman who was somehow employed by the city's most feared criminal organization, which meant she collected looks everywhere she went. On the subway, in the building lobby, in the elevator, though the looks here had an added layer of bafflement that she'd never quite gotten used to. Inside the syndicate, the bafflement was laced with something sharper. The executives didn't know what to make of her. The bodyguards had run out of ways to be dismissive. After 3 years, most of them had settled into a kind of grudging acceptance, the way you accept the presence of a piece of furniture that doesn't match the rest of the room, but has somehow never been moved. Dojin himself treated her the way he treated every employee, with precise, impersonal efficiency. He gave instructions. He expected them executed. He did not make small talk. He did not ask about weekends or families or how she was settling in. In 3 years, he had said her name exactly enough times that she'd stopped counting, and each time it came out like a file being closed. Final, clean, moving on. She respected that, actually. She respected it more than the executives who smiled at her face and then talked over her in meetings. Dojin never pretended she didn't exist. He just treated her existence as a logistical fact rather than a human one, which was cold, but at least it was honest. She wasn't in love with him. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, in those moments on the subway home when she was tired enough to be honest. She admired competence, and Dojin was relentlessly, almost violently competent. But admiration wasn't love. She'd been careful about that distinction. The engagement announcement came on a Thursday. Dojin called a brief all-staff meeting in the main conference room, which was unusual enough that people arrived early and stood a little straighter than usual. He stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit and informed the room, in approximately 4 sentences, that he would be marrying Han Seo-rin, daughter of Han Group Chairman Han Jae-won, in a ceremony scheduled for the following spring. There would be a transition period. Staff should expect to meet the future Mrs. Kong in the coming weeks. That was all. Zuri had written it down in her notes because that was her job. She'd looked up Han Seo-rin that evening on her phone, sitting on her apartment floor eating delivery noodles. The search results were what she expected. Heiress, philanthropist, photographed at approximately 900 events in the past 5 years, consistently described as elegant, brilliant, and charming. The photos showed a woman who moved through rooms like she'd built them herself. Zuri had closed the search results and gone to bed. She met Seo-rin 3 weeks later, on a Monday morning, when the woman arrived at headquarters in a white coat with a security detail of her own and announced to the lobby that she intended to familiarize herself with operations before the wedding. She'd looked at Zuri for exactly 3 seconds upon introduction, a fast clinical assessment, top to bottom, and then looked away. Zuri recognized that look. She'd been receiving versions of it her entire life. Within the first week, Seo-rin had requested that Zuri move her workspace from the executive anteroom to a smaller office 2 floors down. The reason given was restructuring. Zuri moved without argument. She moved her plants, her sketchbook, Ha-yoon's extra pencil set, and the small framed photograph of her mother that she kept turned slightly toward the wall so visitors wouldn't see it and ask questions. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself this was temporary, that she'd ridden out difficult periods before, that her job was to be invisible and useful and not to take things personally. She was failing at the last part. It was hard not to take it personally when Seo-rin began referring to her in the third person while Zuri was standing in the room. Have the heavy secretary send those documents by noon. Tell the American girl she's not needed at the 4 o'clock. It was hard not to take it personally when Seo-rin arrived for a working dinner with Dojin and found Zuri updating a calendar at the conference table and said, loudly enough for the room to hear, "I didn't realize they'd let anyone in here." What Zuri hadn't expected was Ha-yoon. She'd assumed that Seo-rin, whatever her faults, would understand the fundamental reality of marrying a widower with a traumatized child. You were careful. You were patient. You treated the child like something that needed to be earned. Seo-rin treated Ha-yoon like an obstacle. Zuri first noticed it in small things. Ha-yoon's lunch portion changed, smaller, plainer, the things the child liked quietly removed from the menu. Ha-yoon's art supplies disappeared from the corner of the playroom where she usually kept them. When Zuri asked the household staff what had happened, 2 of them exchanged a look she understood immediately and then told her they didn't know. She started keeping the sketchbook in her own bag. Then Dojin left for Busan. It was supposed to be a 4-day negotiation with a coalition of southern port operators. Legitimate business, the kind the syndicate maintained to keep its legal structures intact. Dojin briefed Zuri before he left, held calls, deferred approvals, 1 pending contract she should route to his second-in-command Park Sung-min. Standard protocol. The morning after his car left, Seo-rin dismissed Park Sung-min. Then she dismissed the household manager, 3 of the senior bodyguards, and the rotating security team that had been with Dojin's family for 6 years. She replaced them with her own people, men Zuri didn't recognize, men who didn't know Ha-Yun's name or her medical history or the fact that the child had exercise-induced asthma that could turn serious in cold environments without warning. Zuri had stood in the lobby and watched it happen and felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. By the second day, she understood the architecture of what was happening. Seorin had kept her specifically because removing the secretary would have raised questions. But keeping her on 2 floors down, buried in filing tasks and rescheduling emails, meant Seorin had effectively isolated herself with Hae-yun and a security team that answered only to her. Zuri had started finding reasons to be on the executive floor. She brought documents that didn't need delivering. She took the long way to the copy room. She watched. What she saw made her feel sick. She saw Ha-yun standing in the hallway outside her room at 11 in the morning, still in her pajamas, holding her stomach. She saw the way the child flinched when a door opened near her. She saw Seorin crouch down in front of Ha-yun in the corridor one afternoon. And from 30 feet away, through the glass partition, Zuri watched the woman's face do something that made Zuri's hands go still on the folder she was carrying. She couldn't hear the words. Ha-yun could. And the child went completely white. Zuri walked away before she did something that couldn't be undone. She walked to the elevator and stood inside it with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, breathing through her nose the way her mother had taught her when she was small and frightened and needed to think. Her mother's voice, whenever she was very still, "Baby, you can't fix everything, but you can decide which things you're going to try." She decided. On the 3rd day, she started bringing food. Not from the cafeteria, from outside the building, on her lunch break. Things she bought at the small convenience mart 2 blocks east. Rice balls. Individually wrapped crackers. The small bottles of strawberry milk that she'd noticed Ha-yun reach for once in the break room refrigerator before changing her mind and putting it back, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to want it. She left them in Ha-yun's room when Seorin was occupied in the executive suite. The first time she wasn't sure Ha-yun had even touched them. The second time she came back to find the wrappers folded neatly on the windowsill. The way Ha-yun folded things, precise and small, like she was making herself take up less space. On the 4th day, she got caught. She was coming out of Ha-yun's room with an empty bag when Seorin turned the corner at the end of the hall. The 2 women looked at each other across 20 feet of marble flooring, and Zuri watched the calculation happen behind Seorin's eyes. Fast, cold, arriving at a verdict before Zuri had time to open her mouth. "I told you," Seorin said, walking toward her, "to stay on the lower floors." Ha-yun needed what Ha-yun needs, Seorin said, and her voice had dropped into something quiet and absolutely certain, "is none of your concern." Zuri held the empty bag at her side. "She's not eating enough. She's fine." "She is not fine." The words came out before Zuri could stop them. She felt them land in the air between them, and she didn't take them back. "She hasn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. She's wearing yesterday's clothes, and she flinched when I knocked on her door like she was expecting something worse than a knock." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Seorin's hand moved. The slap split Zuri's lip and sent her sideways into the corridor wall, one shoulder slamming the marble hard enough to leave a bruise. The pain bloomed hot and immediate. She tasted copper. She stood there for a moment with her hand against her face and her heart going very fast, and then she straightened. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Seorin's voice was precise and pleasant, like a woman ordering from a menu. "Sneaking food to that child like I'm some kind of monster." "You are a monster," Zuri said. Her voice shook. She didn't care. Seorin looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that inventories damage already done and damage still available, and then smiled. It was a beautiful smile. Zuri had noticed from the beginning that Seorin's worst moments came with beautiful smiles. "Bring security," Seorin said to the man at the end of the hallway, without looking away from Zuri. "And bring the child." The last thing Zuri heard before the door to the security vault sealed shut was Ha-yun's voice, small, confused, asking a question in Korean that Zuri's 3 years of language classes hadn't prepared her for. She pressed her hand against the steel door and made herself listen. The breathing on the other side of it had already started to change. The breathing on the other side of the vault door was getting worse. Zuri could hear it. Thin, labored, a sound like paper tearing in slow motion. Hyun wasn't crying. That was almost worse. Crying meant fight left in you. This sound was something quieter and more frightening. The sound of a small body working very hard just to keep doing the most basic thing it knew how to do. Zuri pressed her palm flat against the steel and leaned her forehead against it. The metal was cold enough to sting. Ha-Yoon. She kept her voice low, even. The way you talk to someone standing on a ledge. I'm right here. I'm not leaving. No answer. Just that breathing. The security vault was 3 levels underground, accessible only through the building's service elevator and a reinforced stairwell that required a keycard Zuri no longer had. Seorin's men had escorted her down here after the hallway. 2 of them, one on each arm, not rough, but not gentle either. The professional indifference of people doing a job they hadn't been hired to feel anything about. They'd put her outside the vault rather than inside it, which Zuri had spent the first 10 minutes trying to understand before she realized. Inside the vault, she could comfort Haeun. Outside it, she could hear everything and do nothing. Seorin understood cruelty the way engineers understood load-bearing walls. She knew exactly where to apply pressure. The guard posted at the stairwell door was a man Zuri hadn't seen before last week. Young, mid-20s, wide through the shoulders. He'd been standing with his arms crossed since they brought her down here, and he hadn't looked at her once. She tried anyway. She has asthma, Zuri said. The child inside that vault has asthma, and she doesn't have her inhaler. You understand what that means? Nothing. It means she can stop breathing. Zuri kept her voice flat, informational, stripped of the panic that was climbing her throat. Not dramatically, just quietly. Her airway closes and she can't get enough oxygen, and eventually she goes unconscious. That's what's happening right now on the other side of that door. The guard's jaw shifted. A small movement. He was listening. I'm not asking you to let her out, Zuri said. I'm asking you to get her inhaler. It's in her room, top drawer of the nightstand, blue cap. You bring it down here, you pass it through the food slot at the bottom of the door, and a little girl doesn't die in a syndicate basement tonight. That's all. The guard looked at her for the first time. His eyes were doing something complicated. Then his radio crackled, and Seorin's voice came through it, flat and clean. No contact with the child, no exceptions. The guard looked away. Zuri turned back to the door. She stood there for a moment with her hand still on the steel and her split lip throbbing and the taste of blood sitting at the back of her throat, and she thought about her options with the methodical exhaustion of someone who has already run out of good ones and is now sorting through what's left. The guards were Seorins. The household staff that remained were Seorins. Park Sung-min was gone. The senior bodyguards who had known Ha-Yoon since she was 4 years old, gone. Dojin's personal assistant, the one who might have had a secondary emergency contact, reassigned, first day of the week. Seorin had been thorough. You had to give her that. Whatever she was not careless. The only thing she'd left in place was Zuri, and Zuri was beginning to understand that this too had been calculated. Not oversight, strategy. Keep the secretary. Let her watch. Let her understand exactly how little her presence mattered. It was the kind of cruelty that wanted a witness. Zuri thought about the service elevator. She thought about the stairwell. She thought about the 3 floors between her and the executive level, and the executive level between her and Dojin's private office, and what was inside Dojin's private office, that she was absolutely, categorically, under pain of immediate termination, or worse, forbidden from touching. Hyun made a sound behind the door. It wasn't a word. It was just air, not quite making it where it needed to go. Zuri pushed off the wall. I need to use the bathroom, she told the guard. There's one on level 2. You can walk me there yourself if you want. The guard considered this. It was a reasonable request. He was a practical man doing a practical job, and the alternative was an incident he didn't want paperwork for. He jerked his head toward the stairwell. She didn't run. Running would have ended it. She walked, measured, unhurried, the walk of a woman who had somewhere to be and was not particularly concerned about who knew it, up 2 flights of stairs and through the service corridor to the main building. Then she went up. The executive floor was quiet in the way expensive places got quiet at night. Not empty, but muffled, like the building itself was holding its breath. The overhead lights were dimmed to their evening setting. The marble floor reflected back a long, distorted version of Zuri moving across it, and she watched herself move and thought, "You are about to do something you cannot undo." She'd made peace with that on the second flight of stairs. Dojin's office occupied the northeast corner of the floor. She had been inside it exactly 4 times in 3 years, always with Dojin present, always for a specific and documented purpose. The office had 2 locks, the standard electronic keypad and a secondary manual deadbolt that Dojin engaged when he was traveling. She had the keypad code. It was part of her executive access, had been since her first month. The deadbolt she did not have. She stood outside the door for 3 seconds. Then she went to the supply closet 6 doors down, found the fire emergency kit mounted inside the left wall, and removed the steel-handled utility tool that facilities used for manual lock overrides during evacuations. It was heavy. It fit her hand well. She was back at Dojin's door in under a minute. The deadbolt took 4 attempts and left a gouge in the door frame that she didn't look at after the first glance. The door swung open. She went in. The office smelled like him, something dark and clean, sandalwood or cedar. She'd never been close enough to identify it precisely. She didn't turn on the main lights. The city came through the floor-to-ceiling windows in gray and amber, enough to navigate by. She moved to the far wall, to the cabinet she had seen referenced exactly once in a document she'd processed 18 months ago. Emergency Protocol Access, Cabinet C, Executive Office, biometric or manual override only. The cabinet was steel, matte black, set flush with the wall behind a hinged panel that looked like a decorative element. She'd noticed it because she noticed everything. It was the occupational hazard of being invisible in a room. You saw what people forgot to hide when they forgot you were there. The biometric lock was a palm reader. She didn't have Dojin's palm. She looked at the utility tool in her hand. The cabinet took 6 hits and a wrenched shoulder and 2 broken fingernails, and it still didn't open cleanly. The door buckled but held, and she hit it again, and on the 8th strike something inside the locking mechanism gave with a sound like a small bone breaking, and the door swung. Inside, 3 phones in individual charging cradles, all identical, all matte black, no visible branding. A handwritten index card taped to the inside of the cabinet door listed them as Priority 1, Priority 2, and Emergency Only. Zuri picked up Emergency Only. It was already on. The screen showed a single contact, no name, just a number. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed until right now, standing in the dark in Dojin's ruined cabinet, the city glowing cold behind her and Hyen 3 floors below, struggling to breathe. She pressed her back against the wall and slid down it until she was sitting on the floor, which was not dignified but was honest, and she held the phone in both hands and stared at the number. She thought about what happened to people who used this phone without authorization. She had heard exactly one story about it, secondhand, from a mid-level logistics coordinator who'd left the organization 2 years ago. The story had ended with the words, "And they never found the second car." She dialed. It rang twice. "Who is this?" Not a question. Dojin's voice, stripped of everything except attention, flat and absolute, a voice that occupied space the way a wall did. Zuri opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "You have 3 seconds, Dojin said, "before I trace this call and send someone to collect the phone and whatever's left of the person holding it." "It's Zuri." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She pushed it. "Zuri Coleman, your secretary. I'm in your office. I broke your cabinet." A pause. "I'm sorry about the cabinet." Silence. A different kind of silence than before. Not the silence of someone about to hang up, but the silence of someone recalibrating. "Why," Dojin said, "are you in my office?" "Because Hyen is locked in the security vault, and she doesn't have her inhaler, and I could hear her breathing getting worse, and there was no one left to call." Zuri stopped, started again. "Seorin locked her in there. It's been bad, sir. It's been bad for days. I should have called sooner. I didn't have a way to reach you, and I didn't know how bad it would get. And I am so sorry. I'm so sorry I waited this long." "Stop." His voice cut through her. Not angry. Something else. Focused in a way that made the air feel different. "How long has she been in the vault?" Zuri checked the time. 40 minutes. Maybe 45. "Her last attack. How bad?" "I don't know. I can hear her through the door. It's It doesn't sound good. A sound on his end she couldn't identify. Movement, maybe. Something fast. Is the primary guard team on site? No, Sioran dismissed them Monday. The men here, I don't know them. They're hers. Another silence, shorter. Go back to the vault, Dojin said. Stay by the door. Don't engage anyone. Don't move. How long? Go, he said, and the line went dead. Zuri sat on the floor of his office for exactly 5 more seconds, because her legs needed that long to remember how to work. Then she got up, put the phone in her jacket pocket, and went. The guard at the stairwell door looked at her when she came back through. He looked at her face, the dried blood at her lip, the eye that was starting to swell at the outside corner, and he looked at the phone-shaped outline in her jacket pocket, and he looked away. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She went back to the vault door and put her hand on it and listened. Ha-eun was still breathing, shallower than before, but still. Hey, Zuri said softly. Hey, I'm back. I told you I wasn't leaving. A sound from inside. Almost a word. I know, baby. Zuri pressed her forehead against the door again. Her shoulder was screaming from the cabinet. Her face hurt. She was so tired she could feel it in her teeth. I know. Just keep breathing for me. You just keep doing that. She didn't know how long she stood there. Long enough for the guard to change his posture. Long enough for the building to make its late-night sounds. The elevator settling. The ventilation shifting registers. The particular silence of a place that knows something is coming. She heard the lobby doors first. Not the sound itself, too far up, too much concrete between her and the street, but the vibration of it, the way the floor registered impact differently when multiple heavy doors opened fast. Then the elevator indicators above the stairwell door lit up, all 3 cars moving simultaneously downward, which never happened at this hour. The guard with the crossed arms was staring at his radio. It hadn't made a sound in the last 20 minutes. Now it made no sound of a different kind. The particular silence of a frequency that's been overridden. He reached for it. Nothing came back. The stairwell door opened. The man who came through first wasn't someone Zuri recognized, but she recognized the type. The particular economy of movement that meant the person had spent years learning how to enter rooms in ways that didn't give you time to react. He was followed by 2 more, and then a 4th, and then Dojin. Zuri had never seen Dojin move like this. In the office, in meetings, in every context she'd known him, he moved with the deliberate control of a man who understood that stillness communicated power. This was different. This was controlled in a different way. The control of something that has been tightly compressed and is now moving with the full weight of what had been held back. He saw her first. She watched him take in her face, the split lip, the swelling, the dried blood, and she watched something move through his expression so fast it was gone before she could name it. The key, he said to the guard. His voice was quiet. That was the most frightening part. The vault key. Now. The guard looked at the 4 men standing behind Dojin and made a very fast, very practical decision about what he was and wasn't willing to die for tonight. He reached into his jacket. Zuri stepped back from the door. The key turned. The vault opened. Ha-eun was on the floor in the far corner, knees pulled to her chest, her small face the color of old paper. Her lips had the faint blue tinge at the corners that Zuri had read about in the medical file and hoped she would never see in person. She was looking at the door with eyes that had gone somewhere very far inside. Dojin crossed the vault in 4 steps and dropped to his knees beside her, and Zuri saw something she had never expected to see. His hands, when he reached for his daughter, were not steady. Ha-eun ah. His voice, for the first time in Zuri's experience of it, was not controlled. It was just a father's voice, raw and ragged and terrified. I'm here. Appa's here. Ha-eun looked at him, and then she looked past him. She looked at Zuri standing in the vault doorway, and she lifted one hand, small and pale and shaking, and reached. Dojin went still. Zuri crossed the vault and went down on her knees beside them both and took Ha-eun's hand, and the little girl gripped her fingers with the desperate strength of someone who has been alone in the dark for a very long time and has finally found something solid to hold. One of Dojin's men appeared at the vault door with an emergency medical kit. Another was already on a phone, the word ambulance cutting clean through the silence. Dojin stayed on his knees next to his daughter, and he looked at Zuri's face for a long moment. The damage written across it, the exhaustion, the hand Hayun refused to release, and he said nothing. He didn't need to. Upstairs, somewhere above them, Seorin was still in the executive suite, still operating under the assumption that she had 4 more days before anyone came back to ask her questions. She was wrong about that. And somewhere in the wreckage of Dojin's office, the broken cabinet door hung open in the dark, and the utility tool Zuri had used to open it lay on the floor where she'd dropped it, and the city outside the window had no idea that the woman who had just broken every rule this organization had was sitting on a vault floor holding a 6-year-old's hand and trying very hard not to fall apart before someone told her it was safe to. It was not yet safe, but it was closer than it had been an hour ago, and for right now, in this specific and terrible moment, that was going to have to be enough. The ambulance didn't use its siren pulling away from the building. Dojin had ordered it, not loudly. He'd said it once to the paramedic team leader, in the flat tone he used for things that were not requests, and the man had nodded and relayed it to the driver, and the vehicle had moved through the underground parking structure and out into the Seoul night in near silence, just the low rumble of the engine and the city sounds coming through the seams of the doors. Zuri rode in the back with Ha-Yun. She hadn't been asked to. Nobody had told her to step in or step back. Dojin had simply moved toward the ambulance, and Ha-Yun had tightened her grip on Zuri's hand, and that had been the only conversation necessary. The paramedic working on Ha-Yun, young woman, efficient, not unkind, had glanced at Zuri's face once and then focused on the child, fitting the nebulizer mask with practiced speed, talking to Ha-Yun in soft Korean that Zuri didn't entirely follow, but understood by tone. "You're safe, breathe with me. That's right, just like that." Ha-Yun's color was coming back. Slowly, unevenly, the way warmth returns to cold hands. First the cheeks, then the lips losing their blue tinge, then the eyes focusing properly again. She hadn't let go of Zuri's hand. She'd fallen asleep gripping it somewhere between the parking structure and the hospital entrance. The nebulizer still misting against her face, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was getting steadier by the minute. Zuri watched her breathe and felt something behind her sternum loosen for the first time in 4 days. Then the ambulance stopped, and the doors opened, and Dojin was there on the other side of them, and the look on his face brought everything back. He rode with them as far as the hospital intake corridor. Then he stopped and turned to one of his men, the one who'd been on the phone continuously since the vault, and had a conversation Zuri was close enough to hear, but quiet enough that she caught only fragments. She caught Bayek, and she caught the Busan meeting, and she caught something that sounded like "not a coincidence," said, in the tone of a man confirming something he already suspected and did not like being right about. A nurse took Ha-Yun from this corridor into a treatment room, and Ha-Yun's hand finally released Zuri's, reluctantly, fingers uncurling one at a time. And the door swung shut, and Zuri was standing in a hospital hallway with a split lip and a bruised shoulder and nothing left to hold on to. She sat down on a bench against the wall. She sat there and looked at her hands in her lap and breathed. Dojin appeared beside her 4 minutes later. She knew it was 4 minutes because she'd been watching the clock above the nurse's station with the specific focus of a person who needs something concrete to look at. He didn't sit. He stood at the end of the bench with his jacket open and his hands at his sides and looked at her face with the same expression she'd seen in the vault. That flash of something raw that he'd almost managed to put back behind his composure. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning." So she did. She was not a dramatic woman by nature. She didn't reach for words that were bigger than what she meant, and she didn't soften things to protect people from information they needed. She told him about the first week, the dismissals, the staff replacement, the relocation of her workspace. She told him about Ha-Yun's food portions and the missing art supplies, and the afternoon she'd watched Seorin crouch in front of the child in the corridor and say something that turned Ha-Yun the color of chalk. She told him about the 4 days of bringing food, and the hallway, and the slap, and the vault. She told him about the guard who wouldn't move, and the stairwell, and his office. "I'm sorry about the cabinet," she said again. It was a strange thing to say in a hospital hallway at 1 in the morning, and she knew it, and she said it anyway because she needed him to know she understood what she'd done. Dojin was quiet for a moment. "The cabinet," he said, "is a cabinet." He pulled out his phone. Not the emergency line, his regular phone, the one she'd processed scheduling through for 3 years. He made a call, said 4 words she didn't catch, and hung up. "I need you to stay here with Ha-Yun," he said. "Where are you going?" He looked at her. "Back." She understood what that meant. She also understood from the particular set of his shoulders as he turned toward the exit that what was going to happen at headquarters in the next hour was something she didn't need to witness and he didn't need to explain. Dojin. She hadn't used his name without a title before. She felt it land strangely in the air between them. He stopped but didn't turn. "Be careful. I know that sounds... I know. But be careful." A pause. Then, "Stay with her." He walked out. Zuri went back to the treatment room door and sat down on the floor beside it with her back against the wall, and she waited. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, sitting in that hospital at 1 a.m. thinking this was about a jealous woman's cruelty toward a child, was that the cabinet Dojin had come back to wasn't the one Zuri had broken open. He found it in Seorin's suite. She was still there when he arrived. She hadn't run, which told him 2 things. Either she didn't believe she needed to, or she'd been told reinforcements were coming and was waiting for them. He learned which one it was within the first 30 seconds of walking through the door, when she looked at him with the particular steadiness of a woman who has prepared for this conversation and is not afraid of it. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Dojin. She said his name with the familiar ease she'd been using for 6 months, the ease that had seemed like comfort and now felt like a tool she'd been sharpening. "This is a misunderstanding. Where," he said, "is the key to the internal communications room?" A pause. Small, almost imperceptible. "I don't know what you mean." "The room on sub-level 1, behind the security panel, the room that requires a code that only I and Park Sung-min have. Sung-min is in Incheon. I have mine." He let the silence sit for a moment. "Someone accessed that room while I was in Busan. The system logged it." Something moved through Seorin's expression. It was fast and well-controlled, and she almost caught it in time. Almost. "I need you to explain that to me," Dojin said. "I don't have access to that room. You know I don't." "I know you shouldn't." He walked to the desk in the corner of the suite, the one she'd appropriated from the household manager's office and had moved up here on Tuesday. He opened the top drawer, then the second. Then he crouched and opened the bottom drawer and reached to the back of it, and his hand found what he was looking for. A small magnetic strip card, the kind used for secondary access overrides on older syndicate security systems. He straightened and held it up. The color left Seorin's face. Not all at once, gradually, the way expensive makeup reveals the skin beneath it when the light changes. "This is a clone of Sungmin's access card," Dojin said. "The duplication logs on this system show it was made 10 days ago, before I left for Busan." He turned it in his fingers. "You want to try again?" The woman who answered him was not the same woman who had said, "This is a misunderstanding." The transition was almost physical, a dropping of something she'd been holding up, a settling into a posture that was harder and more angular, and in its own way more honest. "You were never going to hold on to this organization," Seorin said. "You know that. You're good at violence and you're good at fear, but you don't have the infrastructure. You never built the right alliances." Dojin said nothing. "The Bake Syndicate has 17 distribution networks you've never been able to touch. They have port access in 3 countries. They have legislative relationships you couldn't buy with everything you own." She said it without heat, factually, as if she were presenting a business case. "When my father agreed to this engagement, I told them I could deliver the Kong network from the inside. It wasn't personal." "Ha-Eun," Dojin said. His voice was very quiet. "Tell me that part." For the first time, something flickered in Seorin's eyes that might have been the beginning of discomfort. "The child complicated things," she said. The silence that followed that sentence was the most dangerous silence Zuri had ever heard described to her, when Dojin recounted it much later. He stood in it for a full 10 seconds, and then he said, "How?" "She's an heir. As long as she exists, the succession is fixed. If something had happened to her before the wedding, if something had happened." He repeated it back, flat, stripped of everything. "The organization would have needed stability, a new direction. I would have provided it. The internal communications room on sub-level 1, they found later, had been used to relay the schedule of Dojin's Busan meeting to a contact number that traced back to a Beck Syndicate logistics coordinator. The crucial syndicate negotiation that had taken him out of Seoul had not been arranged by his own people. The original meeting had been real, but the timing, the specific 4-day window, the detail that Dojin would be unreachable by standard channels, that had been fed outward, carefully, to people who were waiting for exactly that window to begin moving pieces into place. Hayan had not been a coincidence of cruelty. Hayan had been the plan, the vault, the inhaler, the isolation. It was meant to look like negligence if it went wrong and like tragedy if it went right. And either way, Seorin would have been the grieving future stepmother, present in the building, horrified by the accident, already positioned as the steady hand the organization needed in a moment of loss. One of Dojin's men found the secondary communication device in the lining of Seorin's travel case at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning. It had 14 outgoing messages in the past 4 days. The most recent, sent 40 minutes before Dojin walked through the hospital exit, read, "Asset secured, timeline intact, confirm position." The reply, sent 23 minutes later, read, "Confirmed. Move on schedule." Dojin read that exchange standing in the middle of Seo-rin's commandeered suite with 3 of his men behind him and the woman herself across the room, and the expression on his face, according to the man who later described it in the most careful economical terms he could find, was not anger. It was something colder than anger and more permanent. "Tell me," he said to Seo-rin, "who confirmed?" She looked at him. "You kill me, you lose the only thread you have." "I'm aware." "Then we have something to discuss." What they discussed, the terms, the leverage, the specific and terrible negotiation that happened in that suite in the hours before dawn, Zuri learned in pieces, over time, from Dojin himself in the rare moments he chose to account for things. She was not there for it. She was on a floor outside a hospital room, her shoulder against the wall and her knees pulled to her chest, half asleep when her phone buzzed at 3:47 in the morning. A message from a number she didn't have saved. She knew the cadence of the syntax immediately. "Ha-in stable?" She typed back, "Yes, sleeping. Numbers look good." 30 seconds passed. "Good." Then, after another pause, "The man who was on guard at the stairwell. Did he touch you?" Zuri looked at the message for a moment. "No," she wrote. "He didn't." "All right." She sat with the phone in her hands after that, the hospital making its nighttime sounds around her. The soft announcement systems, the distant roll of a cart, someone's low voice at the nurse's station talking about something ordinary. The fluorescent light above her buzzed at a frequency she'd stopped noticing an hour ago. She thought about what Seorin had built, not the cruelty. She'd understood the cruelty almost immediately, but the architecture of it, the patience of it. Months of a performance so precise that Dojin, a man whose entire life had been organized around detecting deception, had not seen it, had chosen not to see it maybe. She wondered about that, about the specific blindness of grief, about how a man who had lost a wife might want very badly to believe that the woman smiling at him across a dinner table was exactly what she appeared to be. She wasn't angry at him for it. She was tired, and her face hurt, and she was sitting on a hospital floor at 4 in the morning, and angry felt like a luxury she couldn't afford right now. At 6:15, the treatment room door opened and the night nurse told her Ha-Eun was asking for her. Zuri went in. Ha-Eun was sitting up in the hospital bed with the nebulizer gone and a small cup of juice on the tray beside her, and she looked at Zuri with those dark, watchful eyes and said, in her careful, rarely used English, "Your face." "I know." Zuri sat in the chair beside the bed. "It looks worse than it is." Ha-Eun reached out and very gently, with 2 fingers, touched the swelling at the corner of Zuri's eye. The touch was so light Zuri barely felt it. What she felt instead was the specific weight of being seen by someone who didn't need you to pretend. "Does it hurt?" Ha-Eun asked. "A little." Zuri turned her hand over on the bed, palm up. "How's your breathing?" Ha-Eun put her small hand into Zuri's. "Better." They sat like that for a while, the room getting lighter as the morning came through the window, neither of them talking much, which was fine. Ha-Eun had never needed much talking. She needed presence. She needed someone who stayed. Dojin arrived at 8:40. He looked like a man who had not slept, which he hadn't. He stood in the doorway of Ha Yun's room for a moment, taking in the scene. His daughter sitting up in bed, Zuri in the chair beside her, their hands linked. And then he came in and sat on the edge of the bed and spoke to Ha Yun in Korean for several minutes, low and serious and careful. And Ha Yun listened and then said something that made his jaw tighten and his eyes close briefly. When he looked at Zuri again, his face had settled into something she hadn't seen before. Not the executive composure, not the controlled authority, something beneath both of those things, older and less managed. "We need to talk," he said to her, "when she's rested." "I know. There are things you're going to hear that—" He stopped, started again, more carefully. "The situation is more complicated than what happened in this building." Zuri looked at him. "I figured." He studied her face. "You're not afraid." It wasn't quite a question. She answered it anyway. "I'm terrified," she said. "I'm just also very tired, so it's hard to tell them apart right now." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it, brief and involuntary, there and gone before it could be named. "The people Seorin was working with," he said quietly, making sure Heian was occupied with the cup of juice and not listening, "are not going to accept what happened last night as a conclusion. They had a timeline. That timeline is now disrupted. Disrupted timelines make organizations like the Beck Syndicate dangerous in a specific way." "How specific?" "They'll move faster. They've already confirmed position, which means they have people in place. People who don't yet know the operation has been compromised." He said the next part without inflection, which made it worse. "They're going to come looking for what they were promised. And the woman who promised it to them is currently in a room in this organization's custody, which means I now have a choice about what happens next." Zuri was quiet for a moment. She looked at Ha Yun, who had finished the juice and was now studying the hospital bracelet on her wrist, with the focused interest of a child who catalogued small things. "What are the options?" Zuri said. Dojin looked at her steadily. "One option ends this quietly and leaves a gap in what we know that will cost us later. The other option—" He paused. "The other requires Seorin's cooperation, her genuine cooperation, which requires giving her something." "What does she want?" "To walk away." His voice didn't change. "To deliver the Beck confirmation contact in exchange for her freedom." Zuri felt the weight of that land in the room. "And you're considering it." "I'm considering what happens to Hayan," he said. "If there are Beck operatives in this city who still believe they have an active operation targeting my daughter, and I have eliminated the only person who can call them off." The room was very quiet. Hayun looked up from her bracelet. She looked at her father and then at Zuri and back to her father, tracking the silence between the adults with the radar of a child who has learned to read rooms the way some children learn to read books, early, out of necessity, because the information in them kept her safe. She reached over and put her hand on her father's arm. Dojin looked down at her hand. The expression on his face in that moment was the most unguarded thing Zuri had ever seen on a human being, a man coming apart and holding himself together at the same time, through the simple, unbearable fact of his child's hand on his sleeve. "Okay," Zuri said quietly. She said it to both of them. "Okay, tell me what you need." Dojin looked at her. "I need someone Haiyun will stay calm for," he said, "while I do something she cannot see and you will not want to watch." Zuri nodded once. "And after," he said, "I need someone I can trust with what comes after." The word trust sat in the room between them, and Zuri felt the full weight of it. What it cost a man like this to say it, what it asked of the person it was said to, what it meant in an organization where the last person trusted with something important had been engineering the death of a 6-year-old. She thought about the vault door, about the cabinet, about the phone call and the shaking hands and the emergency line, and the 3 seconds she'd sat on Dojin's office floor, trying to decide whether the thing she was about to do was brave or simply the only thing left. She thought about her mother's voice. "You can't fix everything, but you can decide which things you're going to try." "All right," she said, and that was the moment. Not the slap in the hallway, not the phone call, not even the vault, that everything changed. They moved Hayan out of the hospital before noon. Not to headquarters. Dojin had made that decision before he left the room, quietly and without explaining his reasoning, though Zuri understood it without explanation. The penthouse was compromised in a way that went beyond Seorin's presence. It had been accessed, surveilled, used as a relay point. Even cleared and secured, it would carry the psychological residue of what had happened there, and Ha-yun had already been asked to survive too much inside those walls. They went to a secondary residence instead, a townhouse in Mapogu that Zuri hadn't known existed until one of Dojin's men handed her an address card in the hospital parking structure. Clean lines, quiet street, a small garden in the back that caught the morning light. The kind of place that looked like nobody lived there specifically, so that nobody would look at it twice. Zuri settled Ha-yun into a bedroom on the second floor, while two of Dojin's men swept the building and a third stood at the front entrance with his hands folded and his eyes on the street. Ha-yun didn't ask questions. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched Zuri unpack the small bag the hospital had sent with them. The spare clothes, the medication schedule, the follow-up inhaler now clipped to the outside pocket where both of them could see it, and then she lay down and was asleep within minutes, the specific deep sleep of a body that has spent days running on adrenaline and has finally, provisionally, been given permission to stop. Zuri sat in this chair beside the bed for 20 minutes after Ha-yun's breathing evened out. Then she went downstairs. Dojin was in the kitchen. It was a strange place to find him, standing at the counter with his jacket off and his sleeves pushed to the elbows, a cup of something hot between both hands, looking out the narrow window at the garden. He looked, for the first time in Zuri's experience of him, like a man who was tired in the way that sleep didn't fix. "She's out," Zuri said. He nodded without turning. She sat down at the kitchen table. Her shoulder had stiffened badly overnight, and moving her arm above chest height sent a bolt of specific pain down through her elbow. She'd wrapped it with the first aid kit from the bathroom, which had helped some and not enough. "The Beck contact," she said. "Did Seorin give you a name?" Dojin turned from the window. "She gave me a location." "That's not the same thing." "No." He set the cup down. "It's better. A name can be abandoned. A location with active personnel is harder to vacate quickly." He looked at her with the evaluating directness she'd gotten used to over 3 years. "She's agreed to make contact. Tell them the operation is still viable. Get them to confirm the assembly point. And then we go to the assembly point." Zuri processed that. How many people does the Beck Syndicate have at this assembly point? Seorin estimates 12 to 15. Operational team, not a command structure. The people who were positioned to execute once the internal work was done. A pause. The internal work being Ha-yun. The kitchen was quiet. Dojin. She said his name the same way she had at the hospital, without a title, without the professional buffer she'd maintained for 3 years. He didn't react to it this time, which told her something had shifted. 12 to 15 people. How many do you have? Enough. That's not a number. It's the answer I have. He picked up the cup again. I need Seorin to make the call in the next 2 hours. The window on their timeline was coordinated with something else. Another event. Another operation I haven't identified yet. If they move past that window without confirmation, they'll pull back and reposition. We lose the assembly point and we start over with less information and more time for them to anticipate us. Zuri looked at her hands on the table. The knuckle of her right index finger was scraped from the cabinet. She hadn't noticed until now. What do you need me to do? She said. Stay with Ha-yun. Stay in this building. Don't open the door for anyone you don't recognize and don't use your phone to contact anyone outside this address. He said it without inflection, the operational precision that was his natural register when things were in motion. The man outside the front door. His name is Choi. If something happens and you can't reach me, you reach him. What kind of something? Any kind. He moved to the doorway. Then he stopped. He had a habit of stopping in doorways, she'd noticed. Not hesitation, more like he was tracking something, running a final check before a door closed behind him. Zuri. Yeah. What you did in the office. He said it carefully, like someone carrying something fragile across a room. Breaking the cabinet, using the line. A pause that lasted a beat too long. I've had people in this organization for 15 years who wouldn't have done that. She looked at him. I know what it cost you, he said. I'm aware of what you were risking. I know you are. I want you to know that I'm aware of it. It was an odd thing to say. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her in 3 years. And it was still precise and controlled and missing whatever word he would have needed to say what he actually meant. But she understood it. She understood it the way she understood most things about him, sideways, through inference, through paying attention to the spaces around what he said. Come back, she said. That's all. He left. The 2 hours that followed were the longest of Zuri's life, which was saying something given the 45 minutes she'd spent outside a vault door the night before. At least then she'd had something to do. Here she had Hae-Eun sleeping upstairs and Choi visible through the front window and a kitchen that belonged to nobody, and time moving at the specific glacial pace of waiting for news that might be very bad. She found tea in the cabinet. She made it badly, wrong steep time, too much water, and drank it anyway because it gave her hands something to do. She sat at the kitchen table and went through everything she knew in the order she knew it, the way she did with complicated scheduling problems. Lay it flat, find the sequence, identify what was missing. What was missing was the other event. The one Dojin hadn't identified yet, the thing the Baek timeline was coordinated with. Seorin had given him the assembly point. Seorin had not, apparently, given him everything. People in Seorin's position never gave you everything in the first conversation. They gave you enough to establish value and held the rest as insurance. Zuri thought about the 14 outgoing messages on the secondary device. She thought about the most recent one, asset secured, timeline intact, and the reply, confirmed, move on schedule. She thought about what on schedule meant when the schedule had a coordinating event attached to it. She went upstairs. Hae-Eun was still asleep. Zuri stood in the doorway and looked at her. The even breathing, the small hands loose on the blanket, the hospital bracelet still on her wrist that nobody had thought to remove. And then she went back down and called the number Dojin had left. It rang 4 times. Then, Coleman. Not Dojin. One of his men, the one who'd been on the phone continuously at the hospital, the one who handled logistics. I need to ask something, she said. The secondary device from Seorin's room, the 14 messages. Did anyone look at the ones from 3 days ago, not the last 2? A pause. Why? Because Seorin told him the assembly point, but I don't think she told him what the assembly point is coordinating with. And if there's a second event on their timeline, hold on. She held. She listened to background sounds, movement, a door, 2 voices talking over each other briefly. Then, what are you looking for specifically? Anything that references a location that isn't the assembly point. Another address, another time. Anything that looks like a second piece of the operation rather than part of the first. More background. Then a longer silence. Then, there's a message from day 2, references a port facility, Incheon. A pause while he was reading. It says primary transfer confirmed for the same window. That's all. Zuri's hand tightened on the phone. Primary transfer, she said. Not primary target, transfer. Yeah. That's not about Hae-Eun. She said it slowly, working through it in real time. That's about the network, the Kong distribution network. They weren't just trying to take the organization from the inside through marriage. That was the cover. The real operation is a physical transfer. Incheon port, same window. They're moving to take control of the actual infrastructure while the internal operation runs. Silence on the other end. Get that to Dojin, she said. Right now. He's already at the... Right now. The line went quiet. She stood in the kitchen holding the phone and felt the specific cold clarity of a problem that has just gotten larger and more immediate simultaneously. The assembly point was a distraction. Not entirely. The 15 Baek operatives were real, and the threat to Hae-Eun was real, and that operation needed to be shut down. But shutting it down while the port operation ran uncontested meant winning one battle and losing the one that actually determined the outcome. Her phone buzzed. A message from the logistics number. He knows. Adjusting. Then, 40 seconds later, from a different number, Dojin's direct line, the one he almost never used for text. Stay in the building. She almost laughed. She typed back, obviously. She didn't stay in the building. She told herself later that she hadn't made the decision consciously, which was partially true. What happened was more like a series of small practical observations that accumulated until the conclusion was unavoidable. Choi was at the front door. Hae-Eun was asleep with her inhaler clipped to the bag beside her. The townhouse had a back door through the garden. The Incheon port facility wasn't an address she had, but the Kang Syndicate's port operations were something she'd been processing documentation for 3 years, and the primary Incheon facility was in every logistics report she'd ever filed. She knew exactly where it was. She left a note on the kitchen table that said, Ha-yun is upstairs, inhaler is clipped to her bag, I'll be back, and she went out the back door. The port at Incheon in the early afternoon had the particular industrial noise of a working facility. Machinery, vehicles, the low horn of a cargo vessel somewhere beyond the container stacks. Zuri moved through the outer perimeter on foot, which was both conspicuous and the only option she had, and she was aware of how she looked, a woman with a bruised face and a stiff shoulder moving through a port facility in clothes that had last been cleaned 2 days ago, and she did not have the energy to care. She found the facility's administrative building by following the signage and went in through the front entrance, which nobody stopped her from doing because the front entrance of an administrative building is where people who are meant to be there go, and moving like you're meant to be somewhere is 90% of being allowed to be there. What she found inside the building was not what she expected. What she expected, Beck operatives in the process of executing a transfer, a situation she could observe and relay and then leave. What she found, Park Sung-min, Dojin's second-in-command, who was supposed to be in Incheon on legitimate business, who had been dismissed by Seorin, or had appeared to be dismissed, who was standing in the facility's main operations room in conversation with two men Zuri didn't recognize, over a table covered in documents that bore the Kong Syndicate's administrative seal. He looked up when she came through the door. The expression on his face lasted less than a second before he controlled it. But Zuri had spent 3 years in rooms with men who controlled their expressions, and she knew what a man looked like when he saw something he hadn't expected and was rapidly calculating what that meant for him. She knew what that calculation meant. Coleman, he said, smooth, almost warm. What are you doing here? Her shoulder was burning, her face hurt. She was standing in a room with a man who had just looked at her the way a person looks at an unexpected variable, and she was alone in Incheon with no car and a phone that had Dojin's number and a logistics coordinator who was currently dealing with 15 armed men at an assembly point across the city. I was in the area, she said. Sungmin looked at the two men across the table. Something passed between them. Fast, wordless. You should sit down, Sungmin said. He gestured to a chair against the wall. You've clearly had a rough couple of days. I'm fine standing. Zuri. He said her name gently, with concern, the performance of a man who is worried about a colleague. You look like you've been through something serious. Why don't you tell me what's going on? She looked at the documents on the table, at the Kong administrative seal on them, at the signatures at the bottom of the visible page, signatures that authorized a transfer of operational control for 3 port access agreements, effective immediately. She looked at Sungmin. How long? She said. His expression shifted, slightly, the warmth fading, the calculation becoming more visible. How long what? How long have you been running with them? She kept her voice level. Her heart was going very fast. Because the Busan meeting, Dojin's trip, that came through your office, the scheduling came through you. Seorin got the timing, got the window, and somebody had to give it to her before she fed it to the Baek contact. That was you. The room was very quiet. You're tired, Sungmin said, and you've been through something frightening, and you're making connections that... The access card, Zuri said. The clone. Someone who knew the internal security system well enough to know which card to clone and how to duplicate it. SEO Rin didn't know this building well enough to identify Park Sung-min's specific access level as the right one to copy. She needed someone to tell her. Sung-min looked at her for a moment. Then he straightened and the warmth was entirely gone, and what replaced it was simpler and colder and in some ways easier to deal with because at least it was honest. Sit down, Coleman, he said. No. You're alone. You don't have a weapon. You don't have backup. He said it without anger, almost apologetically. Dojin is occupied. By the time anyone realizes where you are... Her phone rang. Everyone in the room looked at it. She looked at the screen. Dojin. Sungmin's hand moved toward his jacket. She answered it and said, as fast and clearly as she could before anything else happened, Sungmin, Incheon facility. He's been running with them from the beginning. The transfer documents are already on the table. Sungmin's hand stopped. Dojin's voice came through the phone. Don't move. I'm not planning to, she said. I mean, don't move from where you're standing. Stay on the line. She held the phone against her ear and looked at Sungmin across the room and felt her heartbeat in her split lip and her damaged shoulder and the soles of her feet on the concrete floor. All the places her body was currently reminding her that it was made of something fragile and had been asked to do too much in the last 4 days. Sungmin looked at the two men across the table, then back at Zuri, then at the phone in her hand. He made the same calculation the vault guard had made the night before, the fast, practical assessment of what he was and wasn't willing to commit to. And she watched him arrive at a different answer than the guard had. His hand completed its movement toward his jacket. The door behind Zuri opened. 3 of Dojin's men came through it fast and without ceremony, and the room went from quiet to extremely occupied in approximately 4 seconds, and Sungmin's hand stopped again, this time permanently, and the 2 men across the table made a decision that was smarter than Sungmin's and put their hands flat on the surface in front of them. Zuri stepped to the side. Her legs were not entirely steady. Coleman. Dojin's voice was still in her ear. Report. She looked at Sungmin, being separated from his jacket by someone whose job was to be thorough about these things. She looked at the documents on the table, the Kang seal on them, the signatures that hadn't quite been completed. She looked at the port facility around her, the legitimate infrastructure that 15 years of Dojin's work had built, and that someone who'd sat across from him in 100 meetings had spent months engineering to hand over. Transfer documents are on the table, she said into the phone. Unsigned, not yet executed. A breath. You got here in time. A pause on his end. You got here in time, he said. She didn't answer that. Her shoulder was screaming and her knees wanted to do something embarrassing, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the last 3 hours was beginning to metabolize into something that felt very much like sitting down on the nearest available surface. She sat down on the nearest available surface, which was a crate against the wall, and held the phone and listened to Dojin give instructions to the men in the room in rapid Korean, and she thought about Ha-Yoon asleep in the townhouse with the inhaler clipped to her bag, and she thought about the note she'd left on the kitchen table, and she thought about the fact that she had just walked into a situation that could have ended several different ways and had ended the one way that required her to still be breathing. Sungmin was being walked toward the door. He passed close enough that she could have reached out and touched him. He didn't look at her. Dojin came through the door 40 seconds later. He looked at her on the crate against the wall, and his jaw went tight in a specific way she'd learned to read over 3 years. The compression of something that wanted to come out and was being held back through sheer organizational discipline. I told you, he said, to stay in the building. I know. Explicitly. I know. She looked up at him. But I figured something out and you needed to know it, and there wasn't time to explain it first and then wait for someone else to act on it. He looked at her for a long moment. Are you hurt? Not newly, she said. Everything that hurts right now was already hurting before. He crouched in front of her, which put them at eye level, which was not a position she'd ever been in with him. This close, she could see the exhaustion in him clearly, the shadow under his eyes, the slight tension at the corners of his mouth, the way his shoulders were carrying something invisible and heavy. Sungmin has been embedded with the Bake network for approximately 8 months, he said. We found the rest of it in the last hour. He was the inside architecture. Seorin was the face. The port transfer was the actual objective. The rest of it was pressure, meant to destabilize and distract. And Ha-Yoon, his face did the thing it had done in the hospital room. The unguarded thing. Ha-Yoon was collateral pressure. Make it personal. Make it urgent. Keep me reacting instead of thinking. It almost worked. Yes. He said it without defensiveness, just a fact. It almost worked. They were very close in the quiet of the operations room, the port noise coming through the walls, his men moving around them with the practiced efficiency of people who understood when to be invisible. She could see the exact line where exhaustion had overridden control in his face, the places where 3 years of composure had been worn through by one night and one morning, and a series of decisions that had cost him things he hadn't expected to lose. What happens now? She said. He looked at her. Now, he said, we go back to Ha-Yoon. He stood and offered her his hand, and she took it, and he pulled her to her feet, and for a moment they were standing very close in the middle of a room that smelled like industrial salt and old paper. And then he didn't let go of her hand immediately, and she didn't pull it back, and neither of them said anything about that. Outside, through the facility's high windows, the afternoon light was dropping toward the harbor. and somewhere across the city, in a room that smelled like medicine and new sheets, a 6-year-old was sleeping through the quietest afternoon she'd had in a week, unaware that the last thread of what had been built against her had just been cut. But the cutting wasn't finished yet. Seorin was still in custody. Sungmin was now in custody. The Beck operatives at the assembly point had been contained, but contained wasn't dismantled, and dismantled wasn't finished. And somewhere in the Beck network's command structure was a person who had authorized this operation, and who did not yet know that every piece of it had just collapsed inward like a building with no foundation, and that person was going to have thoughts about what happened next. Dojin's phone rang as they reached the door. He listened for 11 seconds and then said one word: when. Whatever the answer was, it changed the angle of his shoulders. He hung up. He looked at Zuri. The Beck command structure has called a meeting, he said. Tonight. She looked at him. They don't know it's over yet, he said. They think the operation is still running. They're meeting to receive the transfer confirmation. His eyes were doing the thing they did when he was 3 steps ahead of everything in the room and moving fast. If we intercept that meeting before they receive word, you take the command structure, Zuri said. Not just the operational team. All of it, he said. Tonight. The door was open. The harbor light was in his face. He was looking at her with something that was not quite a question but needed her answer anyway. The way the last few days had needed her answers. Not because he required her permission, but because something had changed between them in 48 hours that made him want her to know what was coming before it arrived. All right, she said, and they walked out into the afternoon, and behind them the unsigned documents sat on the table, and the Kong seal on them caught the light, and outside the harbor moved the way harbors do, indifferent and enormous, and completely unconcerned with the human machinery running at its edge. And tonight was still coming, and it was going to require everything they had left. They went back to Ha-Yun first. That was non-negotiable, and Dojin didn't try to negotiate it. He rode in the back of the car with Zuri in silence, while one of his men drove and another sat in the front with his eyes on the mirrors. And the city moved past the windows in the pale afternoon light. Ordinary soul, traffic and street vendors, and a woman walking a dog past a convenience store. The whole indifferent machinery of a city that had no idea what had happened in its margins over the last 48 hours. Ha-Eun was awake when they arrived. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the townhouse with a glass of juice and a piece of paper she'd found somewhere, drawing on it with a pen. She looked up when they came in, and her eyes went to Zuri first, checking, cataloging, running the same rapid assessment she always ran, and then to her father, and then back to Zuri's face. You left, Ha-Yun said. I came back, Zuri said. Ha-Yun looked at the paper in front of her. Then she slid it across the table toward Zuri. It was a drawing, rough, the way 6-year-old drawings were rough, the proportions wrong, and the perspective non-existent. But Zuri recognized herself in it, or recognized the attempt, the dark curling lines that indicated her hair, the larger figure standing beside a smaller one. Beside them, a third figure, taller, separate but not distant. Zuri sat down across from Ha-Yun and looked at the drawing for a long moment. Is that me? She said. Ha-Yun nodded. And you? Another nod. Zuri looked at the third figure. And your dad? Ha-Yun picked up the pen and added something to the third figure. A small detail, a line at the arm that connected it to the smaller figure beside it. Then she put the pen down and looked at what she'd done, satisfied. Dojin was standing in the kitchen doorway. Zuri didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of him in the room, the specific quality of stillness that meant he was holding something together with considerable effort. Are you hungry? Zuri asked Ha-Yun. A little. Okay, let's find you something real to eat before your dad has to go out again. Ha-Yun looked at her father. Where are you going? Dojin came into the kitchen and sat down at the table across from his daughter. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the hospital room. Directly, without the softening that adults usually applied when talking to children about difficult things, because Ha-Yun had never responded to softening and he'd learned that about her. I have to finish something, he said. It won't take long. Will you come back tonight? Yes. Ha-Yun considered this. Promise. Something moved across Dojin's face. Yes, he said again. I promise. Ha-Yun looked at the drawing on the table. Then she picked up the pen one more time and added a detail to the figure that represented her father. Something at the mouth, a curve, upward. She put the pen down. She'd given him a smile in the drawing, the only figure with one. Dojin looked at it for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand briefly over his daughter's, and Hayun turned her hand over and held his fingers the same way she'd held Zuri's in the vault and the hospital, with the complete, uncomplicated grip of a child who had decided you were hers. Zuri got up and went to look in the refrigerator. She stayed with Hayun while Dojin left. She made rice and eggs, which was the only thing she could construct competently from what the townhouse kitchen had available, and Hayun ate it at the kitchen table and drew more horses in the margins of the paper while she chewed, and Zuri sat across from her and drank bad tea and watched the afternoon light move across the table and thought about what was happening across the city in the margins of the evening. She didn't let herself think about it too specifically. There was nothing she could do about it from here, and Hayun needed someone present rather than someone visibly anxious. And Zuri had learned over the past 4 days that anxiety was a thing you could metabolize into something functional if you applied it carefully enough. She applied it to the dishes, to checking Hayun's medication schedule, to finding a second blanket for the bedroom because the townhouse ran cold, and Hayun's immune system had just taken a significant hit. At 8:47, her phone buzzed. A message from Dojin's number. Done. One word. She sat with it for a moment. She typed back, all of it? The reply took 4 minutes. All of it. She put the phone face down on the table and breathed out slowly through her nose. Ha-eun was already asleep upstairs. She'd gone down easily, the deep, untroubled sleep of the genuinely exhausted, the inhaler on the nightstand where both of them could see it. Zuri had sat with her until her breathing was even, and then come back downstairs and sat in the kitchen in the quiet. She sat there for another hour after the message. The townhouse made its nighttime sounds. The heat system cycling, a car passing outside, the particular silence of a building that was built for anonymity and had no history in its walls. She thought about Cincinnati and about the 3 years she'd spent in Seoul and about the specific series of decisions that had led to her being in a safe house kitchen at 9:30 at night, waiting for a mafia boss to come home from what she had carefully not asked too many questions about. She thought about what done meant. She'd understood, from the conversation at the port, what tonight was. The Beck command meeting, the leadership tier, the people who had authorized an operation that included killing a 6-year-old girl for strategic advantage. Done meant those people were no longer a threat. It meant the network that had been moving against the Kong organization for months had been neutralized at its source. It meant the specific danger that had hung over Hayun since before any of them knew it existed was finished. She understood what it took to make something like that done. She didn't ask. Some things you understood without needing them explained, and some things were better left in the part of a person's life you didn't look at directly. She'd known from day one what kind of organization she worked for. She'd made her peace with that the same way she'd made her peace with most things, not by pretending the difficult parts didn't exist, but by deciding what she could live with and what she couldn't and drawing her lines there. Dojin came back at 11:12. He came in through the back, through the garden door, the same way she'd left earlier, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment before he said anything, and she looked at him across the room and read what she needed to know in the set of his shoulders and the specific quality of his exhaustion. He'd changed his jacket, his hands were clean, his face was carrying the thing it had been carrying since the hospital, the unguarded weight of a man who has paid for something and is quietly accounting for what it cost. Hayun's asleep, she said. I know, I checked. You went upstairs first. Yes. She got up and put water on. She didn't ask if he wanted tea. She just made it, the same bad way she'd been making it all evening, and set it in front of him when he sat down at the table, and then sat down across from him. He looked at the drawing Hayun had left on the table, looked at it for a long moment. The Beck command structure, he said finally. 7 people. Tonight's meeting was a quarterly review. They all came in from different cities, he paused. They won't be going back. She nodded. Sungmin will go before the organization's internal tribunal, he said. That process takes time. The outcome isn't in question, but the process matters. It has to be visible to the people who work for me. They need to see that what he did has a consequence that isn't arbitrary. And Seorin. He was quiet for a moment. Seorin is gone. Zuri looked at him. Not, she's alive, he said. He seemed to understand what she was asking. She's been released. Without the Beck network and without Sungmin, she has nothing, no leverage, no infrastructure, no family backing. Her father has already issued a statement distancing himself from her activities. She's been removed from every relevant space. He turned the teacup in his hands. I considered other options. I know you did. Hyun doesn't need to know what her almost stepmother was planning. She needs to know it's over. He set the cup down. She needs to believe that people who hurt children face consequences. The specific nature of the consequences is mine to carry. Zuri looked at the table, at the drawing, at the third figure with the smile Ha-Yun had added, the only smile in the picture. You let her go, Zuri said. I chose what kind of man I am in front of my daughter, he said, even when she's not watching. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the garden was dark, and the Soul Knight was doing what Soul Knights did, enormous and lit and completely indifferent to the human lives unfolding in the small spaces at its edges. I need to tell you something, Dojin said. She looked at him. I knew, he said, within the first week of Seorin's presence in this building, that something was wrong. Zuri was very still. The dismissals, Sungmin's apparent removal, the staff changes. I recognized the shape of it. I've seen that shape before in other organizations, when someone is clearing a space. He looked at his hands on the table. I told myself I was misreading it, that I was suspicious by habit, and she was simply establishing authority the way someone in her position reasonably would. But you weren't misreading it. No. The word landed flat and honest, and he didn't try to soften it. I wanted it to be wrong, he said. I wanted to have made a good decision. I haven't made many decisions that were about something other than the organization in a long time, and I wanted that one to be right. He stopped. Ha-Yun nearly died because I wanted to be right. Zuri looked at him for a long moment. You came back, she said. The meeting ended early. The meeting ending early was coincidence. Maybe. But you answered the phone. You listened. You moved. She kept her voice level, the same way she'd kept it level in the vault corridor, the way she kept it level when things needed to be said clearly without the weight of emotion collapsing them. You can carry the part that's yours, but don't carry the whole thing. He looked at her. Ha-Yun's alive, Zuri said. She's upstairs right now drawing horses in her sleep, probably, and her inhaler is on the nightstand, and she ate a real meal tonight, and she knows you're coming back because you promised her. She leaned forward slightly. That's what's true right now. The rest of it, what could have happened? You can think about that later when there's nothing more useful to do. A long silence. You have a remarkable ability, he said slowly, to say the exact thing that makes it harder to keep being the person I've been. She didn't know what to do with that. She picked up her teacup and found it empty and set it back down. I'm going back to America, she said. The words came out before she'd entirely decided to say them. She felt them in the air and let them stay. Dojin went very still. I don't mean tonight, she said, or soon, necessarily. I mean that I had a life before Seoul, and I haven't thought about it in 3 years, and I think that's probably a problem. She looked at the table. I think I stayed because Ha-Yun needed someone, and because the work was... She stopped, started again. I stayed because it was easier than figuring out what else I was. And that's not a good reason to stay anywhere. The silence stretched. I'm not asking you to stay, Dojin said. She looked at him. I'm asking you, he said carefully, to know that what you did in this building, for Ha-Yun, with the phone, at the port, I want you to know what that was worth. Not to me as the head of this organization. To me. He held her gaze. That distinction matters. I'm aware it may not change what you decide, but the distinction matters. Zuri sat with that. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sliding briefly across the garden wall and disappearing. The heat system cycled again. Somewhere upstairs, Ha-Yun shifted in her sleep. They heard the small sound of it through the ceiling, the particular creak of a child turning over. I'm not leaving tomorrow, Zuri said. I know. Or next month. I know. I just needed to say it out loud, that I could. She looked at him. That I have a choice. That I'm not here because there's nowhere else, and not because I'm afraid of what you'd do if I left. You're not afraid of what I'd do if you left. No, she said. I'm not. Something moved through his expression, something that might have been, in another man, in another context, the beginning of a smile. No, he agreed. You're not. They sat at the kitchen table in the quiet townhouse in Mapogu and drank bad tea and didn't say much else for a while, and it was the most ordinary thing Zuri had done in 4 days, and the ordinariness of it felt like something she needed to sit inside for a while before she moved. The next weeks were not simple. They were not supposed to be simple. Zuri understood that, and she stopped expecting them to be somewhere around day 3 of the aftermath, when the internal tribunal convened and the logistics of dismantling the remnants of the Bayek operation fell to the people who dismantled such things, and Ha-Yun started having nightmares that woke her at 3 in the morning, screaming words in Korean that Zuri's language skills still weren't equal to, but whose meaning was communicated clearly enough by the way the child gripped her wrist in the dark. They stayed in the townhouse for 2 weeks. Dojin's decision, and Zuri didn't argue with it. The penthouse needed to be taken apart, not physically, but psychologically, every room assessed and altered and stripped of whatever Seorin had touched and restructured until it was a home again rather than a crime scene. That took time, and people, and a kind of deliberate attention that couldn't be rushed. In the meantime, the townhouse in Mapogu became something none of them had planned. It became ordinary. Ha-Yun woke up in the mornings and padded downstairs in her socks, and sat at the kitchen table with her juice and her drawings, while Zuri made breakfast badly, and Dojin appeared sometime between 7 and 8 in a state that confirmed he had never in his adult life been a morning person, despite all evidence of his professional efficiency. He drank coffee standing at the counter the same way he'd done the morning after the hospital, facing the garden window, not talking. And Ha-Yun tolerated this without comment because she'd inherited his relationship with mornings and found it reasonable. Zuri did not have their relationship with mornings. She was up early and functional and found their shared silence at the kitchen counter faintly comic in a way she didn't mention because some observations were better kept private. She started teaching Ha-Yun English. Not formally. She didn't sit the child down with worksheets or vocabulary lists. She just talked to her, narrated things, the way her own mother had narrated the world to her when she was small. This is how you crack an egg without getting shell in it. This is what happens when you leave bread out too long. This is the word in English for that feeling you have when something is funny, but you're trying not to show it. Ha-Yun listened with the focused attention she applied to everything, and occasionally produced an English word with the careful precision of someone who understood that language was a tool, and tools should be used correctly. Dojin watched this from doorways, the way he watched most things, at a slight remove, taking it in without participating, with the look of a man who was seeing something he hadn't expected and was deciding what to do about it. On the 12th day, he appeared in the kitchen doorway while Zuri and Ha-Yun were practicing the English names for kitchen objects: spoon, ladle, colander, the thing for grating cheese. I don't know if colander is actually a word children need, but here we are. And he stood there for a moment and then said, in English, with the deliberate care of someone operating in a second language for the first time in a professional context, I think the word she is looking for is greater. Ha-Yun looked at him. Greater, she repeated. Greater, Zuri confirmed. Ha-Yun added it to the list she was keeping in the margins of her drawing paper. Dojin went back to his coffee. Zuri looked at the doorway for a moment and then went back to the colander. On the 14th day, they returned to the penthouse. It was different. She'd expected that intellectually, but the reality of it was something else. The rooms rearranged, certain furniture removed, the wall in the corridor outside Ha-Yun's room, where Seorin had kept the child's drawings, replaced with a fresh surface that was currently blank, and which Dojin had told the household staff to leave for Ha-Yun to do with as she chose. Ha-Yun walked the apartment the day they came back with the systematic attention of a person taking inventory. Room by room, quiet, her socks silent on the floors. Zuri followed at a distance, not too close, giving her space to assess. When Ha-Yun got to the corridor with the blank wall, she stood in front of it for a long time. Then she looked at Zuri. "Can I use blue?" she asked. "It's your wall," Zuri said. Ha-Yun turned back to the blank surface. She reached out and touched it with one finger, a single point of contact, her fingertip against the fresh paint. Blue, she decided. The horses went up 2 days later, in blue pen, spread across a section of corridor wall that Ha-yun had claimed with the quiet certainty of someone who has learned that claiming things requires no announcement and no permission, only the act of doing it. Dojin stood in the corridor one evening looking at them. Zuri stopped beside him. "She's good," Zuri said. "She is." He looked at the horses for a moment. "She gets it from her mother." It was the first time he'd said anything about Ha-yun's mother in Zuri's presence. She let it sit, didn't reach for it or respond to it with more than a quiet acknowledgement, because some things opened and needed air rather than conversation. "Her name was Ji Young," he said. He said it the way you say a name you've kept carefully stored, with the awareness of its weight. "She was a painter, not professionally. She didn't want to do it professionally." A pause. "She said commercializing it would ruin it." She was probably right. She usually was. He was quiet for a moment. Ha-yun has her hands, the way she holds things. Zuri looked at the horses on the wall. She thought about the woman she'd never met, whose daughter she was now teaching the English word for greater, whose death had made Dojin into something harder and lonelier than he'd been before it, whose loss Ha-yun was still carrying in ways that a 6-year-old couldn't fully account for, but expressed in the precision of her silence and the intensity of her attention and the way she drew horses with her mother's hands. "She's going to be okay," Zuri said. "Because of you," he said. "Because of her," Zuri corrected. "I just showed up." He looked at her sideways. "You broke a reinforced cabinet with a maintenance tool and called the emergency line and then walked alone into a port facility where the second in command of my organization was waiting to ensure you didn't leave with information he didn't want shared." "I'm choosing to think of that as showing up with commitment." Something crossed his face. The same thing from the kitchen, the thing that was almost a smile in another man, and this time it went further, brief, unguarded, there long enough to be real. "With commitment," he repeated. "Yes." He looked back at the horses. They stood in the corridor for a while longer, the apartment quiet around them, Ha-yun's voice audible from the study down the hall, where she was explaining something in Korean to one of the household staff, with the patient authority of a child who knows exactly how she wants things done. She sounded like her father. The formal change in Zuri's role happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the vault. Dojin called her into his office, the repaired office, the cabinet replaced, and the door frame patched, and the room returned to its impersonal precision. And he told her, without preamble, that he was restructuring her position within the organization. He told her what the new title was, and what the responsibilities were, and what the compensation adjustment would be. He told her that Ha-yun's welfare fell formally under her oversight, which meant decisions about Ha-yun's care, education, medical appointments, and daily environment came through her first. He told her all of this in the same tone he used for operational briefings, clear, direct, leaving no room for misinterpretation. When he finished, she said, "You couldn't just say you trusted me." "I'm saying it structurally," he said. "That's how I say things." "I know." "Is that acceptable?" She looked at him across the desk, the same desk she'd sat across 3 years ago when a placement coordinator had handed her an NDA and a salary figure that had made her blink twice and sign before she could think better of it. The same desk where she'd processed his schedules and his communications and the logistics of an organization she'd never fully understood and had chosen, anyway, to show up for every day. "Yes," she said. "That's acceptable." She went back to her desk and processed 3 invoices and rescheduled a meeting, and then sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and thought about Cincinnati and the woman she'd been before Seoul, the woman who apologized for the space she occupied and made herself small in photographs and told herself that temporary was fine, temporary was safe, temporary didn't require you to commit to wanting something. She thought about the drawing on the kitchen table in the townhouse, the 3 figures, the smile Ha-yun had given Dojin's figure, the only smile in the picture. She thought about being the person Ha-yun had reached for in the vault, not because she was safe, or because she was powerful, or because she had any of the things this world organized itself around, but because she had shown up. Every day, consistently, with the small things, the sketchbook, the strawberry milk, the blue pen, the presents that didn't require anything from the child in return. She thought, you can't fix everything, but you can decide which things you're going to try. She'd decided. 3 weeks ago, on a vault floor, holding a 6-year-old's hand, she had decided without fully knowing she was deciding. And the decision had cost her sleep and a cabinet and a split lip and a shoulder that still ached when the weather changed, and a version of herself that had believed staying invisible was the same as staying safe. She didn't miss that version. The annual gathering of the region's major crime family networks convened at the Grand Walker Hill in early December. Zuri had processed the logistics for this event the previous 2 years. The guest lists, the security protocols, the catering coordination, the careful diplomatic choreography of seating arrangements for people who had complicated histories with each other and needed those complications managed with precision. She'd done it from her desk, invisible and useful, the way she did most things. This year was different. She stood in the elevator in a charcoal dress she'd bought herself without agonizing over it, which was new, and looked at her reflection in the elevator's mirrored doors, and the woman looking back at her was not performing confidence. She was just wearing it, the way you wear something that fits. The shoulder had healed, the split lip had healed, the bruising under her eye had faded to nothing. What remained was something underneath those things, a quality in the way she stood, a particular stillness that hadn't been there 3 years ago when she'd gotten off a plane from Cincinnati with a placement contract and a deeply inadequate understanding of what she was walking into. Dojin was beside her. He'd said nothing about what she was wearing or how she looked. He'd simply appeared at the elevator on time because he was always on time, and stood beside her the way he'd been standing beside her with increasing frequency over the past weeks, not performing proximity, not making a statement, just present in the particular way that felt, after everything, like the most honest thing about him. The delegation from the Zhong Network, she said. They're at table 6. They have a history with the Mayan group at table 8 that predates your organization's involvement in this event by about 6 years. I moved the Mayan group's dessert service to a different time slot so they won't be in motion through the same space simultaneously. I saw the adjusted schedule. The Choi representative brought his wife this year, which is new. She's seated beside the Yamamoto family's senior liaison, who I'm told speaks some Mandarin. It's the closest language approximation I could manage. You speak to her before the dinner, he said. The Choi wife. She won't know anyone here. Zuri looked at him. She'll be more comfortable, he said, if someone talks to her who isn't trying to extract information. She thought about that. You've thought about how she feels. I've thought about what you would notice, he said, and acted accordingly. The elevator opened into the ballroom level. The room was already populated, 40 tables, perhaps 200 people. The ambient noise of multiple languages and the kind of careful socializing that happened between people who needed to maintain relationships across lines of interest that were sometimes parallel and sometimes not. The room was expensive and dim and precisely organized, and every person in it understood that the organization of the room was itself a communication. They walked in. She felt it, the moment the room recalibrated. Not dramatic, not a sudden silence, more like a subtle shift in attention, the way a room changes when something enters it that doesn't fit the expected pattern. Eyes that moved and then stayed. Conversations that paused one beat longer than natural before resuming. The woman who had organized this event for 2 years from a desk 2 floors below any room that mattered, walking into the room beside the man who owned it. A woman whose size and shape and skin had been, in this world, reasons to look past her. Walking like she wasn't interested in being looked past anymore. Dojin's hand came to the small of her back. Briefly, lightly, the gesture of a man who was not performing ownership, but communicating something simpler and more honest. She is here because I brought her, and I brought her because she belongs here. Then his hand dropped, and they walked further into the room, and Zuri found the Choi wife, a small woman in a blue dress standing near the table with the careful stillness of someone who is very far from comfortable, and went to her and said hello in Korean and watched the woman's shoulders drop 2 inches with relief. The dinner lasted 4 hours. Zuri worked the room the way she'd worked every room in her professional life, carefully, paying attention, reading the spaces between what people said and what they meant. But she worked it now as herself, without apology and without the performance of smallness she'd spent years perfecting. When people spoke over her, she let it happen once and then spoke clearly until she was heard. When a representative from the Beck Network's successor organization, newly restructured, operating now under the terms Dojin had set, introduced himself, and said something about the previous year's event coordinator, she looked at him and said calmly, "I'm the current chief of staff. I've been with the Kang organization for 3 years." He reassessed. She let him. At the end of the evening, when the room had thinned and the tables were being cleared and Dojin was concluding a final conversation with the Yamamoto liaison, Zuri found herself standing at the edge of the room near the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Han River. The city spread below her, and she looked at it. The bridges lit up, the traffic moving, the whole enormous ordinary machinery of Seoul running through the night. She thought about the phone call, the vault door, the broken cabinet, the crate at the port facility. Hyun's hand, small and cold, gripping her fingers. She thought about all the times she'd told herself she was temporary, all the ways she'd kept herself from wanting things too specifically, because wanting things specifically made it possible to lose them specifically, and loss was something she'd organized her adult life around avoiding. She thought about how tired she was of that. Dojin appeared beside her. He stood there for a moment looking at the river. "The Jeong delegation," he said, "handled. The Choi wife." She and the Yamamoto liaison exchanged numbers. They're apparently both interested in the same ceramics artist. "You arranged that." "I noticed it and sat them together. The universe arranged it." He looked at her sideways. "You've been doing that for 3 years," he said, "noticing things, arranging them quietly so the result looks inevitable." "It's my job." "It's more than your job." She looked at the river. "I know," she said quietly. "I just needed a while to let it be more than that." He turned toward her slightly. "Not much. Enough." "The drawing," he said. "Ha Eun's drawing, in the townhouse." She looked at him. "She gave me a smile," he said. "In the picture. I've been thinking about that. She gives you a hard time about your mornings, and she put a smile on your face in her drawing," Zuri said. "She's more generous than you deserve." "Yes," he said. "She is." A pause. "So are you." The river moved below them, and the city moved around it, and the party behind them murmured and settled into its final hour. And Zuri stood at the edge of the room in a dress that fit, and a life that was finally, improbably, starting to feel like it had been chosen rather than defaulted into. "Don't thank me," she said. "I'm not thanking you." She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm telling you," he said, that what you are." He stopped. He was not, she had learned, a man who reached easily for the right word when the right word cost him something. He tried again. "I'm telling you that I see you, all of it, not what you can do for the organization, not what you did in the vault or the port or the office." He held her gaze. "You." The silence held. "Okay," she said. "That's all you have." "You told me you say things structurally," she said. "I'm choosing to receive this one the same way." Something in his face broke open, briefly, completely. The most uncontrolled expression she'd ever seen from him, gone before anyone else in the room could have caught it. But there, real, arrived at the surface from wherever he kept the things he didn't show people. He looked back at the river. She looked back at the river. They stood there together at the window while the city ran below them, all its lights and its traffic, and its millions of people living their ordinary lives in the ordinary margins of a night that didn't know what had happened in its edges over the past weeks. A 6-year-old asleep in a penthouse with blue horses on her corridor wall, and a woman she called hers by the bed. A man standing at a window with his shoulders finally, carrying something closer to the weight of what was actually true rather than the weight of what he'd built to compensate for what he'd lost. A woman who had stopped apologizing for being in the room. Somewhere between the vault door and the ballroom window, in the specific geography of 48 hours that had cost more than she'd expected and returned more than she'd allowed herself to want, Zuri Coleman had stopped being temporary. She hadn't announced it, she hadn't negotiated it, or documented it, or processed it through any official channel. She had simply, in the way that mattered most, decided. And that was enough.